Switching to housing and land use, what is your vision for how we're going to fit people into the city of Seattle, in the coming decades?
So I talk about my vision for Seattle overall is we need to have a city that provides a variety of jobs so that people with different backgrounds and different skills can work in the city. And then we need to provide a variety of housing so that everyone who has a job in the city can live in the city and raise a family here. Then we need to provide all the amenities that make Seattle great so that people want to live in the city. And then the last piece is we need to design the city in a way so that when people live in the city, they are living a small carbon footprint lifestyle. You don't have to ask, you don't have to think about it, you just say, oh, you live in Seattle? Check, you're doing your part, thank you. And we can do all those things, but housing is critical. So we're not going to create more land, so we have to use our existing land more efficiently. I think there's a number of tools we have to look at to make housing more affordable. One is, let's change the zoning land use law so we start to get better designed stuff. Right now we're pretty much stuck in a model where the only thing the developers are building is these 4-packs, at least in my neighborhood and a lot of the neighborhoods outside downtown. And they don't really, no one's happy about them, they're not meeting the needs. And there's a lot of people in the design community that talk about great ideas and they say, I can't build this. They won't let me build this with the codes today, or the fights I would have to go through are so expensive that it's prohibitive. But they have designs. There are good people in town that have great designs that I think would work much better. And so we need to start figuring out how do we allow that to happen. And you know what we have right now sucks. So let's not be afraid to try something else, and maybe it sucks too. But along the way, we'll start finding things that work, and we'll start enabling things that are good projects. So, I believe some system that has a performance-based zoning as opposed to prescriptive, where we say, instead of saying you have to be this far back, and it has to look like this, and it has to have this, saying, you know what I want? If I want a house that someone who makes $60,000 a year can afford to live in, and they don't need a car to use, and I know them as a neighbor because it's designed to interact with the neighborhood well. Design me that one. And when a developer or a designer says, I got it, I say, great, let's try it, let's see how it works. And we'll come back and check in a year and see if it's delivering what we thought. Those are the types of things we need to do. Specifically to get more affordable housing, we need to change the zoning so we can allow smaller units. We need to get rid of the kooky things like the little yards that aren't really useful for anybody, that don't even get any sunlight. We need to look at eliminating parking requirements, starting in areas that are well served by transit, or if they're going to provide a zip car or good bike facilities, to say, here's some alternatives. You don't need to spend the 40 grand on putting a parking garage, in each unit. So that's some of the places I'd start. Allowing mother-in-law units, accessory dwellings, those are all good starts to, the numbers we've seen so far is it doesn't really make a big number difference. But I think the city needs to look at the inventory of jobs they're expecting to create. If we're going to hire 25 firefighters in 2012, we know what those guys make, and we need to match the inventory of housing to that measure. If we're hiring 25 firefighters, I want to have 25 units coming online in the year 2012 that a firefighter and his family can afford. And let's do that across the spectrum. And instead of treating our land use code as a way to really make sure that developers don't make too much money, let's think of it as we need more housing and this type of housing for the city to function well. And that's a benefit to the city. And so let's define that. Like I said, with transportation, I want the department to focus on moving in people and goods. Land use, I want to define their success on, did we get the type of housing we wanted in the quantity we wanted in the time we wanted?
Are you kind of saying, Mike, that your vision of our land use code in terms of creating jobs and creating housing, there should be a connection, a legal connection in the land use code between the creation of jobs in certain areas and where people are living?
Right.
Makes transit sense, but when it comes into having some of this development or legal authority into someone's backyard, there's a different fight. Are there places where you see that there are opportunity for this type of...
Obviously around the light rail station, I think we're there in the city. I think the rapid ride, the BRT systems that we're going to roll out, knock on wood, I hope they do it right. I'm worried that they're not, but where we're making investments like that, let's do it there. Where there's existing lines, where I live in Fremont, the 44 is a pretty good line, the 358 is a pretty good line. That's a great spot to do it. Let's start there and show that we can do it right. The fight we get from the neighborhoods, there's some people that just are against everything.
Right.
But the general sense I get is people are worried because they don't want to lose the character of their neighborhoods. And I think that they've been focusing too long on the wrong things. They've been focusing on the buildings. You know what makes my neighborhood special? the buildings are cool and they're relevant and I want good design, but it's the people that live in my neighborhood. And the people that live in my neighborhood today aren't the same people that were living there 14 years ago. And I worry that if we work on protecting the buildings in our neighborhood, that when my kids get out of college and come back to town, they're going to say, you know, this looks like where I grew up, but it doesn't feel like where I grew up. And what's really important, I think, is to have the diversity of people in neighborhoods so that that's the real character. You know, those are the characters in the neighborhood. And so let's do whatever we have to on the zoning side so that we preserve the real character of the neighborhoods, which is, you know, Fremont's where wacky people live, and whatever your neighborhood is. But let's focus on that, because I think we're a little bit distracted in focusing on the wrong things.
Mike, one clear difference that's emerged between you and at least one of the other candidates running for position 8, David Miller, is the issue of developer impact fees.
Yeah.
From what I understand, he views it as an opportunity to get some money to invest in infrastructure that's built concurrently with new residential development. And you've come out against them and says it might hurt the affordability of the housing, but if there's anything that you could add to that to walk us through your thinking on that.
You know, I appreciate when you're developing Snoqualmie Ridge and you have a school system that is not capable of serving 10,000 people moving there, that you need to have, you know, I understand the argument for developer impact fees in those areas where there's no infrastructure and you have to build it. And that also creates a higher cost of housing in Snoqualmie Ridge, which I'm okay with, because I'd much rather have those people live in Seattle than in Snoqualmie Ridge. In Seattle, we have the infrastructure. You know, we could use more transit for sure, but we have schools that we're closing because there's not enough people in them. We have the roads in place, the sewer lines in place. You know, for the most part, this is where we want people to be living, is in the city, in this dense area where it already can serve them much more cost effectively than further out. So let's not put impact fees on there to discourage them. We need to look at housing in the city is a good. You know, we don't say let's tax the school kids to raise more money to pay for schools, and you know, we typically don't look to doubling transit fares to raise more money for transit. You know, those are benefits, and we want to subsidize those. I mean, we intentionally do that. And I think the same thing with housing. I prefer not to subsidize as much housing as we can, but let's let the market rate housing be as affordable as we can make it. And so I think the impact fees don't make sense. Let's capture those revenues somewhere else. Let's use tolling revenue to help pay for more transit as opposed to cost on housing. So, when someone moves in the city, they're doing the right thing. They're doing exactly what society has asked of them. We should reward them as opposed to punish them. So I do differ with David Miller on that point.
So speaking of housing, do you support the affordable housing levy, and would you do anything different in the design of the package?
I do. You know, so long term, I think, as I just said, subsidizing housing, we're going down this road that I don't like where it's headed, which is ultimately that there's not going to be anyone left in Seattle to pay the subsidy to subsidize all of us to actually live here. And so we have to change the dynamic of housing. That's a long-term answer. And in the short term, you know, we're always going to need some subsidies for housing, but we need to make that at the lowest end and try to do everything we can so that we can generate market rate housing at most income levels. Because again, you know, a housing levy increases the cost of living in the city so that we can then decrease the cost of living in the city. I mean, I get that some people pay it and other people don't, but at some point more and more people can't afford to live here, and so we're hurting ourselves. So long term, we need to generate way more housing. As far as the existing levy, I think it's great. I probably would have pushed for a little bit higher level. I think 160 is what some of the folks were talking about. As far as the split between, you know, 70% of mean income versus 30%, you know, to me it's discouraging that the low-income housing people have to be break into factions to defend different groups of low-income housing. And I think it's just more emblematic of the problem that we haven't figured out how to deal with housing. We need more of it for all those people. And so let's figure out how we can kind of open that spigot and let some good housing be created. So, you know, with the good housing comes the other amenities. You know, when I'm talking about smaller units, that means people don't live in their unit all the time. It's a place where you sleep and you live in the city. So we need sidewalk cafes, we need parks, we need, you know, all the things that make the city great, you know, whether it's, you know, cultural, art museum space, you know, we have lots of these amenities, but we just need to keep encouraging that stuff and say, you know what, your house is where you cook your meals sometimes and you sleep, but a lot of the other stuff comes in the neighborhood. We'll use that shared. I mean, how many guest beds, guest rooms sit empty 98% of the time in the city? Is it really cost effective for us all to have a guest room in our house so that when the in-laws come, and we really don't want them staying there that long anyways, wouldn't it be better if just each neighborhood had a bed and breakfast for half a dozen folks and save that square footage? So anyways, that's what I think.